as you read, and really in Holyfield and in the Allen and Hughes on the Discovering Our Roots, there is an important aspect of Restoration Movement history that involves precursors and foundational types of thinking about a variety of issues. It wasn't suddenly a movement that in one sense appeared out of the blue that was completely different than anything else that had ever taken place. Although when you kind of read some of the writings of certain people within the movements, you would think sometimes that they had this idea that Restoration Movement just kind of appeared out of nowhere, or that the history prior to the 19th century is unimportant. And I think that's just a Protestant trend in general of thinking about church history as being so many, 1,000+ years of the Dark Ages, as it used to frequently be called, and then suddenly the light dawns again with the Protestant Reformation. Now, certainly there's a lot of truth to that in the sense that during the Middle Ages, a lot of Catholic Church leaders and others kind of lost their way morally and ethically. There are a lot of things within Catholicism doctrinally that I disagree with in developments there. But that being said, we can't ignore that as if it doesn't have an effect on Christianity, even with us saying so much of the Protestant Reformation was a reaction to that. Well, the same kind of thing with the Restoration Movement, or sometimes referred to as the Stone Campbell movement. And so I'll be using those terms interchangeably. We got to see that history sometimes as being very formative, either in providing positive influences or as early leaders, later leaders were reacting against elements of church history, elements in other and ideas in other religious groups. So I want to talk briefly about some precursor movements, some of which you've already read about briefly in the Allen Hughes book, some that you'll encounter in some of the other texts that we'll be talking about this semester. In a sense, a large part of the restorationist mindset, which is often also called primitivism, reflects trends within the Protestant Reformation. That many reformers in that period of post-Renaissance, early modern Europe saw what they were doing, at least eventually, as attempting to restore apostolic Christianity from the changes that had come in with Catholicism. Now, certainly, and this is something Allen Hughes highlights, those views on restoration often were quite different as to what should be restored, how should it be restored. But in many sense, this idea of there was a pristine original in the apostles' time period, and that has been diverged from and needs to be recaptured. It was a common theme in Protestantism. When you think of people like John Wycliffe, Jan Hus, others, they had that primitivist streak, wanting to restore that the primitive apostolic church. Now, on the other hand, right, a lot of the reform that reformers wanted was moral reform. They weren't interested in restoring an apostolic pattern like the Campbells were, but thought that Catholicism had gotten too lax in its ethics. And certainly, Allen Hughes point to the Puritans, to the Baptists, and others as also being examples of this primitivist and restorationist impulse. One group, or two groups that don't get too much of a mention, at least in the works that we've read so far, are two Scottish and Irish groups based off the teachings of a couple individuals. So, there's a way in which, especially the Glassites and the Haldanes, that Allen and Hughes kind of write off as, they're simply part of this larger trend of Restorationism. In a way, that's true. That it shouldn't be ignored. But, these groups were groups that were directly influential on Alexander Campbell. Right? This is how he came to his ideas about restoration. Yes, it's kind of in the ethos of Puritan England, Puritan New England, Scotland and Ireland, but it's the Glassites, the Glassites or the Sandemanians, and the Haldanes that are particularly important for Scots-Irish culture, especially, which is where Campbell comes from. It's kind of like saying, pardon the expression, right? It's in the water, it's in the Scots-Irish, it's the water in the Scotch-Irish culture of the times, primitivism. And Campbell's drinking from the Glassite Haldane hose. Right? There are other hoses that could be drunk from, but this is the one he's drinking from, even though it's in the water. Right? It's all over the place, but Campbell's getting a lot of it from this. The Glassites were started by a man named John Glass, who was born in 1695. His father had been a minister, and so he too decides to become a minister as well. And so he's eventually licensed to preach and ordained in the Presbyterian Church, which is the established Church of Scotland at the time. Ultimately, in his thinking, he kind of imbibes this notion of the Bible being the sole guide to faith and practice. That the Protestant sola scriptura idea. What's happening here is that he's also becoming concerned with some of the statements of belief, the creeds that are being promoted in Protestantism, that are kind of in addition to the Bible, or at least that's how he kind of sees it that way. Eventually, there's some problems between Glass and the Presbyterian Church, and so he's removed from his post and decides to start a congregational church. Now, the difference between Presbyterianism and Congregationalism had to do with authority. Right? Leadership within the Presbyterian Church had several levels of authority as different churches were bound together in synods. Different synods were bound together in a general assembly. Congregational churches, however, were autonomous. There wasn't a institutional structure that bound them together. And so Glass wants to start that type of church where he doesn't have the authority like he has in Presbyterianism. In addition to Congregationalism, the Glassite movement also made the claim that the bishop office of the New Testament was the same as the office of elder. A lot of that has to do with the tensions between the Church of Scotland, which was Presbyterian, and the Church of England, which was Episcopal, which had that bishop structure. And so the two of them were kind of always in opposition as far as like which type of church governance is the way that the apostles established. And Glass says, well, the elder and the bishop are the same person in the New Testament. There isn't this difference between Episcopal forms of government and Presbyterian forms of government. Let's see, what else? Glass also believed in the importance of having the Lord's Supper or communion, sometimes referred to as Eucharist, but he tended to refer to the Lord's Supper, that it should be done weekly. He also believed and promoted that idea that there should not be located paid preachers in churches, that instead the men of the congregation should take turns delivering the message. Each church should have elders, and certainly the elders would be involved in that for Glass as well, but essentially this idea of what's often been referred to as mutual edification, where each of the men would teach and preach as opposed to having a paid minister. And that still shows up in some churches of Christ even today, and in other religious groups as well. Yeah, it does sound like other groups. Not everybody bought into the mutual edification, but that is one idea that shows up in other religious groups as well, along with things like foot washing, greeting with a holy kiss. These were other things that the Glassites practiced. Not all of those transfer into the American Restoration movement, and as Mark pointed out in the chat, you see these in other groups as well. Connected with Glass was a man named Robert Sandeman, who was born in 1718. He too studied for ministry in the Church of Scotland, but becomes acquainted with Glass and eventually marries his daughter. And he decides to become a weaver instead of a preacher. But eventually he will start preaching within the Glassite church. Now, often these two groups are listed separately, not because there was a lot of, there wasn't a break per se between them, at least as I understand it, but it was more of the Glass movement stayed in Scotland and Ireland, and Robert Sandeman goes to London. And so there's some divergence, brief, small divergence between the groups, but predominantly it's more regional. And so Sandeman is more of a English development. So he moves to London, but they too practice things like weekly Lord's Supper, weekly contribution, the Holy Kiss, or the Kiss of Charity as it's sometimes called. And the Sandeman group also claimed that churches should have a plurality of elders, even though the Glassites said that the bishop and the elder were the same function within the New Testament church. The Sandemanians kind of took that a little bit further and said there should be multiple elders within each congregation. And eventually, Campbell will study both John Glass and Robert Sandeman in their views, and so there's an important influence there as well. Also influential from this background is the work of Robert and James Haldane. They were also from Scotland and Ireland. They came from a rather aristocratic family. Their father was a captain in the East India Company. Robert, for a time, will join the Navy, but later he will become a missionary. James becomes a preacher. They too eventually leave the Church of Scotland and start a Congregationalist movement as well, with James being the primary preacher and Robert being more the financier, the person that's providing the money for missionary work and other things like that. Congregational church government, a rejection of creeds, these statements of belief as having any authority, like the Glassites and the Sandemanians as well. The Haldanes also supported the idea of mutual edification, and they also kind of eventually turned to emphasizing immersion for baptism and not sprinkling, which was prominent in the Presbyterian Church and the Church of England as well. But the Haldanes don't really get very dogmatic about it. But they still kind of are supporting the belief that baptism should be by immersion. Other people will join as well. Particularly helpful is a man named Greville Ewing, who will be kind of the mentor to Alexander Campbell that introduces him to these people. The one that kind of gets him to think about some of their writings and some of their teachings. The Ewing and the Haldanes, however, disagreed about immersion as baptism, and Campbell and Ewing will disagree with that as well. Coming over to the United States, a couple important movements, not in a direct way, right? There's no direct connection here between the Republican Methodists and the Campbell and Stone movements, except that as Campbell and Stone become successful, some of the Republican Methodists will join those movements. But as far as a general ethos of this idea of restoration and some other things, Republican Methodists and the last group we'll talk about here, the Christian Connection, help establish this kind of approach that we'll see in Campbell and Stone as well. So there's a shared affinity of certain beliefs and kind of their evidence of this developing mindset of primitivism. Largely the Republican Methodists were developing in the Virginia and Maryland-ish area shortly before and after the Revolutionary War. The prime individual behind this was a man named James O'Kelly. Kelly was born in 1735. He will eventually convert to Methodism because his son becomes very interested in the Methodist Church. And of course, the Methodist Church at the time is still a part of the Church of England. John Wesley did not seem to, in those early years, want to have a separate church or a separate denomination, but just kind of a movement within within Anglicanism for reform. But especially in the United States, after the after the Revolutionary War, getting ahead of myself. After the Revolutionary War, the group starts becoming a separate organization because of the connections between the Church of England and the Crown. And so Wesley in all of this is trying to figure out what to do, and so he sends over a couple of people as superintendents of the church in the United States. And one of the people that gets some authority here is Francis Asbury, who we could say a whole lot about, very interesting figure within American religious history, but we bring him up here because he gained some authority in American Methodism, and James O'Kelly doesn't care for Francis Asbury. And so eventually, because of Asbury's authority, because of O'Kelly's dislike for him, O'Kelly will lead a splinter group from the Methodist Episcopal Church, and so he and some friends will leave and call themselves the Republican Methodists. But that name itself doesn't last very long because it will join with another group known as the Christian Connection, and will take that name and say that the name Christian is the only name for God's people. And so they kind of drop the Methodist label as they unite with the Christian Connection. So as this is going on in Virginia, Maryland, in New England, there's some similar things going on due to the work of Elias Smith and Abner Jones. And I believe Hughes and Allen briefly talk about them. In the early 1800s, Smith begins rejecting Calvinism, and this seems to be a very important marker for a lot of these figures. O'Kelly, not so much. Methodists tend to be more Arminian, tended to be more Arminian in their outlook, meaning that that God didn't limit who could come to Him. And that the atonement was available for all. But a lot of the other groups here had started in Calvinist movements, and for many of them, there is a rejection. There's a rejection of Calvinism that's going on here, and so you see this in the Christian Connection as well. you know, these people trying to move away from Calvinism. So Smith and Jones will unite because they have similar ideas, and they will begin, especially Smith will, in 1808, publishing a work called the Herald of Gospel Liberty, which is perhaps the first religious newspaper in the world. Certainly not the first religious document, right? But as far as a weekly newspaper, or not a weekly, it was biweekly. As far as a regularly released or a periodical work, this appears to be the first one religiously to show up. Certainly there had been newspapers before, but we're talking about a religious newspaper.